was sold like property, for 2 blankets. But when their eyes met, something changed. What began as a forced trade on a dusty frontier post turns into something neither of them expected. You won't believe what happens next in this powerful and emotional journey through pain, resilience, and hope. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the small settlement near the Red River, where dust swirled in lazy circles between the weathered wooden structures that formed the trading post. It was the autumn of 1862, and the frontier was a place where desperation often trumped decency, where survival meant making choices that would haunt a person for the rest of their days. Among the ramshackle buildings, a young woman named Emma Caldwell stood with her head bowed, her long auburn hair falling across her face like a veil meant to hide her shame and fear. Emma was 17 years old, with pale skin that burned easily under the relentless sun and green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of a different life. Those dreams had died slowly over the past 3 years, ever since her father had been killed in a skirmish with raiders, and her mother had remarried a man named Chester Graves, a bitter drunk who saw Emma as nothing more than another mouth to feed. Her stepfather stood beside her now, his weathered hand gripping her arm with bruising force, while her mother looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her daughter's pleading gaze. Across from them stood a young Comanche warrior named Takota, whose name meant friend to all in his language, though he felt anything but friendly in this moment. He was perhaps 19 years old, tall and lean with strong shoulders and arms that spoke of years spent riding and hunting across the vast plains. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, and his long black hair was adorned with a single eagle feather that marked him as a skilled hunter. Despite his youth, there was a gravity to his presence, a weight of sorrow that seemed to hang around him like morning mist. Takota had not wanted to come to this trading post, had not wanted to participate in this degrading transaction, but his father, the war chief of his band, had insisted. His father believed that taking a white captive would bring prestige and demonstrate their strength to the other bands, but Takota knew the truth was far more personal and painful. His father was trying to replace what had been lost, trying to fill the void left by Takota's younger sister, who had died from fever the previous winter. The grief had driven his father to desperate measures, and Takota, as the dutiful son, had been sent to complete this terrible bargain. The trader, a grizzled man named Polk who profited from human misery without a shred of conscience, stood between the two parties and cleared his throat. His voice was rough as gravel when he spoke, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the group like a heavy blanket. The words he spoke were businesslike and cold, as if he were discussing the trade of horses or cattle rather than a human life. Chester Graves pushed Emma forward slightly and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell. Her hands were trembling, and she kept them clasped together tightly, her knuckles white with the pressure. She could feel the weight of multiple gazes upon her, assessing her worth as if she were livestock at auction. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun on her shoulders, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she fought them back with the last shreds of her dignity. Takota's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He had brought 2 fine blankets as his father had instructed, blankets woven with intricate patterns that represented months of skilled work. The blankets lay folded across his arms, and the weight of them felt like the weight of his own compromised honor. He had always believed himself to be a man of principle, someone who fought only to protect his people and their way of life. But here he was, participating in something that felt fundamentally wrong, something that violated the very core of who he wanted to be. Emma finally lifted her head and met Takota's eyes for the first time. What she saw there surprised her. She had expected cruelty, perhaps hunger or violence, but instead she saw conflict and something that might have been regret. His expression was carefully controlled, but his eyes betrayed him, revealing a young man who was as trapped by circumstance as she was, though in a different way. For a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 young people caught in a situation neither had chosen, both silently wondering how their lives had led them to this moment. Chester broke the spell with his harsh voice, demanding that the trade be completed quickly. He spoke of needing to get back before nightfall, as if he had somewhere important to be, as if selling his stepdaughter were just another errand to be checked off his list. Emma's mother let out a small sob but still refused to look at her daughter, her shoulders shaking with either grief or guilt. Perhaps both. Dakota stepped forward and held out the blankets. His movements were deliberate and slow, and when Chester reached for them, Dakota pulled them back slightly and spoke for the first time. His English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. He addressed not Chester but Emma directly, his voice lower and gentler than she had expected. He told her that he did not wish to harm her, that she would be treated with respect in his camp. He explained that his people had suffered greatly, that they were struggling to maintain their way of life against forces that seemed determined to destroy them, but that did not excuse what was happening here today. He wanted her to know that he saw her as a person, not as property, and that he would do what he could to make her situation bearable. The words were formal and stiff, clearly difficult for him to say, but they were sincere. Emma blinked in surprise, uncertain how to respond. She had expected silence or commands, not this strange attempt at reassurance from someone who was essentially purchasing her like goods from a store. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she possibly say in response to such a statement? "Thank you for promising not to harm me while you take me away from everything I know." The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. Chester, impatient and eager to be done with the whole affair, snatched the blankets from Dakota's hands and shoved Emma toward the young Comanche warrior. She stumbled again, and this time Dakota reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her arm, a stark contrast to the bruising grip her stepfather had maintained all morning. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock through Emma's system, a reminder that she was about to leave with this stranger, to enter a world completely foreign to everything she had known. Her mother finally looked up, tears streaming down her weathered face, and whispered a trembling goodbye that was barely audible over the wind. Emma wanted to scream at her, to demand how she could allow this to happen, how she could choose a man like Chester over her own daughter, but the words stuck in her throat, choked by emotion and the terrible understanding that nothing she said would change anything now. The decision had been made, the transaction completed, and her old life was already slipping away like sand through her fingers. Dakota gently guided Emma toward his horse, a beautiful painted mare that stood patiently nearby. He helped her onto the horse with careful hands, then mounted behind her. Emma sat rigid, her back straight and unyielding, refusing to lean against him despite the practical necessity of the riding arrangement. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing behind her, could sense the controlled strength in his body, and it terrified her, even as some small part of her recognized that he had treated her with more consideration in these few minutes than her stepfather had shown in 3 years. As they began to ride away from the trading post, Emma allowed herself one final look back. She saw her mother collapsed against Chester, who was already examining the blankets with a satisfied expression. She saw Polk counting his commission with greedy fingers. She saw the small settlement that had been her prison for the past 3 years growing smaller in the distance. And she realized with a strange mixture of terror and relief that she was leaving behind everything familiar, even if that familiarity had been painful, and riding into complete uncertainty. The landscape opened up before them as they rode, vast stretches of grassland dotted with occasional clusters of trees. The sky seemed impossibly large, stretching from horizon to horizon in a dome of brilliant blue. Emma had rarely traveled far from the settlement, and the sheer scale of the wilderness both awed and frightened her. She wondered where they were going, how far they would travel, what awaited her at the end of this journey. Dakota rode in silence for a long time, allowing both of them to process what had just occurred. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, he spoke again. His voice came from behind her, quiet but clear, and she had to strain slightly to hear his words over the sound of the horse's hooves and the wind in the grass. He told her his name and explained what it meant. He told her that his camp was still 2 days' ride to the north, that they would stop soon to make camp for the night, and that he would ensure her safety. He spoke of his people's customs, trying to prepare her for what she would encounter, explaining that she would be expected to work and contribute to the community, but that she would not be mistreated. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost like a teacher instructing a student, and Emma found herself listening despite her fear and resentment. When he finished speaking, silence settled between them again, but it felt different now, less hostile and more contemplative. Emma's mind raced with questions she was not yet brave enough to ask. Why had he agreed to this trade if he seemed so uncomfortable with it? What had he meant when he spoke of his people's suffering? What would become of her in this new life that had been forced upon her? And perhaps most confusing of all, why did his gentleness make her feel even more lost and uncertain than cruelty would have? As the sun touched the horizon, Dakota guided his horse toward a small grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and Emma felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease slightly. Dakota dismounted first, then helped her down with the same careful consideration he had shown before. Their eyes met again as her feet touched the ground, and Emma saw something in his gaze that she had not expected to find there, something that looked almost like understanding, as if he too knew what it meant to have your life determined by forces beyond your control, to be trapped between duty and desire, between what was expected and what felt right. The first night under the vast Texas sky was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Dakota had built a small fire with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise as he gathered dried wood and arranged it carefully. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the serious set of his mouth. Emma sat on the opposite side of the fire, hugging her knees to her chest, watching him with a mixture of wariness and reluctant curiosity. He had given her a portion of dried meat and some kind of bread made from ground seeds that she did not recognize. The food was foreign to her palate, but her hunger overcame her hesitation, and she ate slowly, acutely aware of his presence across the flames. Dakota ate his own portion in silence, his gaze occasionally drifting to her face before looking away again, as if he too was uncertain how to navigate this strange and uncomfortable situation they found themselves in. When the meal was finished, Dakota spread out a blanket near the fire and gestured for Emma to take it. She hesitated, confusion evident in her expression, until she realized he intended for her to sleep there while he kept watch. The gesture surprised her, this small kindness from someone who had every right to treat her as property, as something he had purchased with 2 blankets at a dusty trading post. She settled onto the blanket without a word, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders against the cooling night air. Sleep did not come easily. Emma lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the rustling of grass in the wind, the distant call of night birds, the crackling of the fire. She thought about her mother's tear-stained face, about Chester's satisfied smirk, about the life she had left behind. But mostly she thought about the young man sitting across the fire, this Dakota, whose name meant friend to all, and wondered what twist of fate had brought them together in such a terrible way. Dakota, for his part, sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, his rifle across his lap, keeping watch through the long hours of darkness. His thoughts were equally troubled. He had seen the fear in Emma's eyes, the humiliation, the profound sense of betrayal, and it stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He thought of his sister, little Dove, who had been so full of life and laughter before the fever took her. His father believed that bringing a captive into their family would ease the pain of her loss, but Dakota knew better. Nothing could replace little Dove, and trying to do so only compounded the tragedy. As dawn broke across the plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and lavender, Dakota finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a brief rest. Emma woke to find him sleeping, sitting up, his head tilted back against the tree trunk, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. She studied him in the early morning light, this stranger who held her fate in his hands, and felt a confusing tangle of emotions she could not quite name. They rode throughout the second day, covering vast distances across the rolling grasslands. Dakota pointed out landmarks and shared small pieces of knowledge about the land, the best places to find water, which plants were edible, how to read the weather and the behavior of animals. Emma listened, absorbing the information despite herself, recognizing that survival in this new world would require her to learn everything she could. As they rode, Dakota began to speak more freely, perhaps finding it easier to share his thoughts when he did not have to look directly at her. He told her about his childhood, about learning to ride and hunt with his father and uncles, about the vast buffalo herds that had once covered the plains like a living carpet. His voice carried a deep sadness when he spoke of how much had changed in recent years, how the white settlers had pushed further and further into Comanche territory, how the buffalo were disappearing, how his people were being forced to choose between their way of life and survival itself. Emma found herself responding, asking questions, engaging in conversation despite her intention to remain silent and withdrawn. She asked about his family, about the camp they were traveling to, about what would be expected of her. Dakota answered honestly, explaining that his mother had died when he was young, that his father was a respected war chief but had become harder and more bitter since Little Dove's death, that the camp consisted of about 40 people, families who had chosen to resist the pressure to move on to the reservation. He explained that Emma would likely be assigned to work with the women, learning to tan hides, prepare food, and maintain the camp. He promised again that he would not allow anyone to harm her, and this time Emma heard the determination in his voice, the quiet strength that suggested he meant what he said. She wanted to hate him, wanted to maintain her anger and resentment, but it was becoming increasingly difficult when he treated her with such unexpected consideration and respect. That evening, they made camp beside a clear stream that wound through a small valley. The landscape here was more varied, with clusters of oak trees providing shade and shelter. Dakota caught several fish from the stream, using a method Emma had never seen before, his hands moving with swift precision in the water. He showed her how to prepare them for cooking, his hands guiding hers patiently when she struggled with the unfamiliar task. As they worked together, their hands occasionally touching, Emma became acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his body beside hers, of the gentle patience in his voice as he instructed her. She felt her cheeks flush and was grateful for the fading light that hid her reaction. Dakota seemed equally affected, his movements becoming slightly awkward, his explanations trailing off mid-sentence before he cleared his throat and continued. After they ate, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dakota did something unexpected. He began to tell Emma about Little Dove, his voice soft and filled with grief. He described his sister's laugh, bright as morning bird song, her skill with beadwork, her kindness to everyone she met. He explained how her death had devastated their father, how grief had transformed him from a wise and compassionate leader into someone driven by anger and the need to demonstrate strength and control. Emma listened, and as she listened, she began to understand. She saw that Dakota was as much a victim of circumstance as she was, caught between his duty to his father and his own sense of right and wrong. She recognized the weight he carried, the burden of being a good son while maintaining his own integrity. And in that recognition, something shifted between them, a subtle change in the air, a lowering of walls that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. She found herself sharing her own story, telling him about her father's death, about her mother's weakness, about Chester's cruelty, and the 3 years of living in fear and hunger. The words poured out of her, things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, and Dakota listened with the same quiet attention she had given him. When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort. Instead, he simply acknowledged her pain with a solemn nod, his eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond words. They sat together in companionable silence as the fire burned low, both of them lost in their own thoughts, but somehow connected by their shared confessions, by the recognition that they were both trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break them. Emma felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of anger and fear beginning to unravel, replaced by something she could not quite identify, but that felt almost like hope. On the 3rd day of their journey, they finally approached Dakota's camp. Emma's nervousness returned in full force as she saw the circle of buffalo hide teepees arranged near a bend in a river. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear the sounds of children playing, women calling to one another, the general bustle of daily life. Dakota felt her tense against him and spoke quietly, reassuring her once more that he would protect her, that she had nothing to fear. As they rode into the camp, people stopped their activities to watch. Emma felt dozens of eyes upon her, assessing, judging, curious. Dakota guided his horse directly to the largest teepee, where an older man emerged, his face marked by time and grief, his bearing proud and unyielding. This was clearly Dakota's father, the war chief, and Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she realized that her fate would ultimately be decided by this stern-faced man. The chief spoke in Comanche, his voice sharp and demanding. Dakota responded calmly, dismounting and then helping Emma down. He kept himself positioned slightly between her and his father, a subtle but deliberate gesture of protection. The conversation between father and son grew heated, though Emma could not understand the words. She saw anger flash across the chief's face, saw Dakota's jaw set stubbornly, saw the way they faced each other like two stallions preparing to fight for dominance. Finally, Dakota said something that made his father's eyes widen slightly, then narrow in calculation. The chief looked at Emma with new interest, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. He asked a question, and Dakota responded firmly, his hand moving to rest lightly on Emma's shoulder in a gesture that was clearly possessive, but somehow also protective. The chief's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been grudging respect, and he nodded once, curtly, before turning and disappearing back into his teepee. Dakota released a breath he had been holding and turned to Emma, his hand still on her shoulder. He explained in a low voice what had just transpired. His father had wanted Emma to be given to the tribal council to decide her fate, to be distributed as they saw fit. But Dakota had claimed her as his own responsibility, had invoked his right as a warrior to keep what he had traded for. It meant that Emma would be considered his, that she would live in his household and work under his direction, but it also meant that he alone was responsible for her actions and her welfare. Emma did not know whether to feel relieved or more frightened. Being claimed by Dakota meant protection from others, but it also meant she was bound to him in a way that felt both intimate and terrifying. She searched his face for some clue as to what this meant, what he expected from her, but his expression was carefully controlled, revealing nothing. Over the following days, Emma began to learn the rhythms of life in the Comanche camp. An older woman named Gentle Rain, who spoke some English learned from traders, took Emma under her guidance, teaching her the skills she would need to survive. Emma learned to scrape and tan hides until her hands were raw and blistered, to gather roots and berries, to prepare meals using methods and ingredients completely foreign to her. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done at the settlement, but there was a purpose to it that had been lacking in her previous life. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to Emma's life that she had never known before. Each morning, she woke before dawn to help prepare the morning meal, working alongside the other women who had gradually begun to accept her presence. Gentle Rain became something more than a teacher, offering Emma a quiet friendship that helped ease the loneliness and displacement she felt. The older woman never pressed Emma to speak about her feelings, but her presence was a steady comfort in the chaos of adjustment. Dakota maintained a careful distance during those first weeks, respectful of the boundaries between them, while still ensuring her safety and well-being. Emma noticed how he would check on her progress without being obvious about it, how he would leave small gifts outside the teepee he had erected for her, a warm blanket as the nights grew colder, a pair of moccasins he had traded for when he noticed her worn shoes failing, a comb carved from bone that she found one morning wrapped in soft leather. The gifts confused her, touching something deep inside that she had thought long dead. She would hold each item, turning it over in her hands, wondering what motivated this continued kindness from someone who could have simply treated her as the property the transaction had made her. She found herself watching for him during the day, her heart inexplicably lifting when she caught sight of him returning from a hunt or working with the other young warriors. One evening, as autumn deepened and the air carried the first hints of coming winter, Dakota approached Emma as she sat mending a tear in one of the buffalo hides. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, and the camp was settling into the peaceful quiet of evening. He stood beside her for a moment in silence before speaking, his voice carrying a hesitation she had not heard from him before. He asked if she would walk with him, and something in his tone made her heart quicken. Emma set aside her work and rose, following him as he led her away from the camp, toward the river that wound through the valley. They walked without speaking, the only sounds their footsteps in the grass and the distant murmur of water over stones. Emma was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers, of the way the fading light caught in his dark hair. When they reached the riverbank, Dakota finally spoke. His words came slowly, carefully chosen, as he told Emma that he had been watching her these past weeks, that he had seen her strength and resilience, the way she had faced this impossible situation with courage, even when she must have felt only fear and despair. He spoke of his admiration for her, of how her presence had begun to change something in him, to thaw the frozen grief that had encased his heart since Little Dove's death. Emma listened, her throat tight with emotion, as Dakota continued. He told her that he knew their beginning had been wrong, built on a transaction that should never have occurred, but that he hoped they might find a way forward together that honored both of them. He spoke of wanting to make amends, of wanting to give her a choice that had been stolen from her at that trading post. He wanted to know if she could ever see a future here, not as his captive, but as his partner, his equal, someone who chose to stay rather than someone who had no other option. The question hung in the air between them, profound and terrifying and somehow beautiful. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes as she tried to process what he was asking, what it meant. She thought about the life she had left behind, the mother who had abandoned her, the stepfather who had sold her like livestock. She thought about these weeks in the camp, the hard work and the gradual acceptance, the unexpected friendships forming, the sense of purpose that had been missing from her existence for so long. And she thought about Dakota, this young man who had been given every excuse to treat her poorly, but who had instead shown her nothing but respect and kindness. She thought about the gifts he left, the protective way he positioned himself between her and potential threats, the patience he showed as she learned and adapted. She thought about how her heart had begun to respond to his presence, how she found herself seeking glimpses of him throughout the day, how the sound of his voice had become something that brought her comfort rather than fear. Emma turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes in the fading light. Her voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her as she spoke. She told him that she had been so lost, so broken by everything that had happened, that she had believed herself incapable of hope or happiness ever again. But he had given her something she had not expected to find, a reason to wake each morning, a glimpse of what life could be when shared with someone who truly saw her, who valued her not for what she could provide, but for who she was. She told him that yes, she could see a future here, but only if it was built on truth and mutual choice. She needed to know that he wanted her to stay because he cared for her, not because of obligation or duty to his father or to the trade that had brought them together. She needed to know that what was growing between them was real, something that belonged to them and not to the circumstances that had forced them into each other's lives. Dakota reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hands in his. His touch was warm and solid, grounding her in the present moment. He told her that every word she spoke was exactly what he felt, that from the moment he had seen her at that trading post, something in him had recognized her, had known that she was meant to be more than a transaction, more than an attempt to fill the void left by his sister's death. He spoke of how she had given him hope again, how watching her adapt and grow stronger had reminded him that life continued even after devastating loss, that new connections could form even in the aftermath of grief. He told her that he was falling in love with her, that he knew it was fast and complicated, and built on a foundation that should have made such feelings impossible, but that his heart did not seem to care about logic or propriety, or the opinions of others. Emma felt her breath catch as she heard those words, as she allowed herself to truly feel what had been building inside her own heart these past weeks. She realized that she too was falling in love with this gentle warrior who had purchased her with 2 blankets but had given her back something far more valuable, her sense of self-worth, her belief in the possibility of goodness, her hope for a future worth living. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them, and when Dakota lowered his head toward hers, she rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, a question and an answer all at once, a sealing of the promise they were making to each other in the gathering darkness beside the river. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion flowing between them. They stood together in the twilight, hands clasped, foreheads touching, and spoke quietly about the future they would build together. Takota told Emma that he would speak to his father, that he wanted to make their union official according to the customs of his people, but that this time it would be a true marriage, entered into freely by both parties, based on love and respect, rather than trade goods and desperation. Emma agreed, her heart full of a joy she had never expected to feel again. They talked about the challenges they would face, the cultural differences they would need to navigate, the prejudices they might encounter from both whites and Comanches who would not understand or approve of their union. But they also spoke of the strength they found in each other, the way their separate griefs and hardships had somehow prepared them to appreciate what they had found together. As they walked back to the camp hand in hand, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above them, Emma reflected on the strange and painful journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about how what had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her, being sold to a stranger for 2 blankets, had somehow transformed into the best thing, leading her to someone who saw her, valued her, loved her in a way she had never experienced before. The following days were filled with preparation and anticipation. Takota spoke to his father, and though the war chief was initially skeptical, he could not deny the change he saw in his son, the return of light to eyes that had been shadowed by grief for too long. He gave his blessing, recognizing that perhaps this unconventional union might bring healing not just to Takota, but to the entire community that had been struggling under the weight of loss and change. The women of the camp, led by Gentle Rain, helped Emma prepare for the marriage ceremony. According to Comanche tradition, they created beautiful garments adorned with intricate beadwork, taught her the rituals and customs she would need to know, and welcomed her into their circle with a warmth that brought tears to her eyes. Emma realized that she was not just gaining a husband, but an entire family, a community that would support and sustain her. The ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning, with the entire camp gathered to witness the union. Takota stood tall and proud in his ceremonial clothing, his eyes never leaving Emma as she approached. She wore the beautiful dress the women had made, her auburn hair decorated with beads and feathers, her face radiant with happiness and hope. They exchanged vows according to Comanche custom, speaking promises of loyalty, respect, and love before the assembled community. When the ceremony concluded and they were declared husband and wife, the camp erupted in celebration. There was feasting and dancing, storytelling and laughter, a joyous affirmation of life and love in the face of all the hardships they had endured. As the celebration continued around them, Takota and Emma slipped away to the teepee that would now be their shared home. Inside, in the warm glow of a small fire, they held each other close, marveling at how far they had come from that terrible day at the trading post. Emma traced the lines of Takota's face with gentle fingers, seeing in him not the stranger who had purchased her, but the man who had chosen to love her, who had given her back her life and filled it with purpose and joy. Takota kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, each touch a reaffirmation of his love and commitment. He whispered that she had saved him just as much as he had saved her, that together they had found a way to transform something dark and painful into something beautiful and life-giving. Emma agreed, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love for this unexpected gift, this second chance at happiness. In the months that followed, Emma and Takota built a life together that honored both of their backgrounds and experiences. Emma taught Takota some English phrases and shared stories of her childhood before tragedy had struck, while he taught her the Comanche language and the deep connection his people had with the land. They found ways to blend their different worldviews, creating something new and unique that belonged entirely to them. The camp itself began to thrive in ways it had not since Little Dove's death. Takota's father, seeing his son's happiness and the positive influence Emma had on the community, softened in his grief and became once again the wise and compassionate leader he had been before. The successful and loving marriage between Takota and Emma became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even from the darkest circumstances, light and love could emerge. As winter gave way to spring and the plains bloomed with new life, Emma discovered she was carrying their first child. The news brought immense joy to both of them and to the entire camp. Dakota was tender and attentive, constantly ensuring Emma's comfort and well-being, while the women of the tribe rallied around her with advice and support. On a warm summer evening, as they sat together outside their teepee watching the sunset paint the sky in glorious colors, Emma leaned against Dakota's strong shoulder and reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace and contentment. She thought about the girl who had stood terrified at that trading post, sold for 2 blankets, believing her life was over. She could never have imagined then that such horror would lead to such profound happiness. Dakota wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting gently on the growing curve of their child, and told her that he loved her more than words could express. Emma turned to kiss him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had seen her worth when everyone else had treated her as disposable, who had chosen love over duty, compassion over tradition, hope over despair. Together, they had taken the broken pieces of their separate lives and created something whole and beautiful. They had proven that love could flourish even in the harshest conditions, that hope could be reborn from the ashes of grief, and that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. As the stars began to emerge above them, and the sounds of the camp settling in for the night filled the air, Emma and Dakota sat wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for every moment of their journey together, and eager for all the moments yet to come in their shared future.